Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. All right, well, fall is here, and while most people are cleaning out their fields, there is a very specific group of farmers that is still pretty high in production, and that is our high tunnel growers. So we wanted to give a little bit of attention to them and talk about integrated pest management when it comes to high tunnels and try to help you all get ahead of pests, basically.
Yes.
Because in a high tunnel, once they get there, you're overwhelmed. And so keeping populations low is really important.
Yeah, what we're talking about here is utilizing high tunnels to extend that growing season. It's a great way, especially for those cool crop vegetables like spinach, for lettuce, cabbage, stuff like that. Things that typically don't require highlight. They also like shorter days. So going into the cold or the colder seasons where the days are shorter, it really just helps out as far as that crop response to light. And having that high tunnel regulate some of the temperature so that you don't get a hard frost or even a mild frost sometimes and ruin your crop. But high tunnel usage, great way to not only extend the growing season, but actually maybe even get better production in certain crops. And I would argue that you probably do get better production for spinach and lettuce and leafy vegetables. Most leafy vegetables. Correct me if I'm wrong, Karen.
Oh, yeah, they're going to enjoy that cooler temperature, and just like your cool season grasses are going to produce more when it's not super hot out. You'll also have that same response in some of your cool season crops, your spinach, your kale, your cole crops. But I do want to make sure that we don't discourage you all from, if you still have a farmer's market up and running, make sure you continue to support your local farms. A lot of our farms do incorporate floating row covers and deep mulch systems, which help keep the soil warmer longer, so they are able to produce much further outside the season than you would think. I still have a couple farms in this area that are in full swing on green beans, and even strawberries are still kicking it. So make sure that you're continuing to support your farmers markets until they shut down from the season. That's really important to help keep the local food system alive.
That's right. That's a great point, Karen. And I just want to touch again on the lights or the day lengths.
Mm-hmm.
So lettuce and spinach, definitely lettuce. Let's go with that. Spinach, I'm not sure, but I suspect. But lettuce is definitely a long day crop. So what happens is that plant likes to flower if it sees longer days and shorter nights. So when the days start flipping, when you start getting the shorter days and longer nights, you're going to have more vegetative growth. And typically that's what I mean by utilizing a high tunnel to take advantage of that light duration to have a crop in the stage that you want to sell it.
Right.
And not only are you going to get more leaves, but you're also going to get better tasting leaves, because once that lettuce bolts, it tastes bad.
Yeah, it gets bitter.
Yeah, the plant undergoes a chemical change to transition basically from vegetative reproductive, making it taste bad.
Yeah, indeed. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can protect your crops, a little bit about the differences between growing in a high tunnel versus growing out in the field, and some of the tips and tricks that may help you maintain a healthier crop while you are having a longer growing season. Because, in the fields, the winter comes and it reduces the pests that are out in the fields. They go dormant and some of them die off. And you start basically in the beginning of the year, not from scratch, because you have your base pest bank that's out in the weeds and everything. But if you are in a high tunnel, those pests don't really go into that dormant phase. They kind of keep working. And so from the high tunnel to a field, crop rotation is always going to be important. And regardless of where you're growing, you should always be rotating your crops. Fungicide applications, when you're looking in high tunnels, and any pesticide application really, a high tunnel is considered a closed building. And so your pesticides that you're choosing to use need to be approved for inside a closed environment.
So would you say, Karen, would you say that as far as pesticides go, you need to get something ready for greenhouses to use in high tunnels?
Yeah.
And that rating is out there. So there are plenty of insecticides. Really, I guess in a high tunnel situation, people typically worry less about weeds. Like you don't typically hear about herbicides in greenhouses, but you definitely have to manage the insects. I'm not saying that you're not going to get weeds in a low tunnel or high tunnel, but as far as finding pesticides for that use, I don't think there's too many out there. But there's definitely a lot of insecticides ready for greenhouse production.
Oh yeah, there are. It's just they have different formulations in the most part than the things you would use in the field, and most of that's to help reduce the amount that you're going to be inhaling while you're applying this chemical. And yeah, weed seeds aren't going to come in. A lot of times, weed problems for greenhouses come with whatever, or for high tunnels, come with whatever the seed bank that was initially in the soil. So if there were weeds in the field when you cleared it to put the high tunnel in, those weeds are still going to come up. But also with your transplants, if you are getting starts from somewhere and the soil that they're using has weed seeds in it, then you could potentially get some. Or if the seed that you buy has weed seeds in it, you can also get some weed problems that way.
Yeah, and start your weed control before you put the tunnel. But with any kind of pest management, you always want to use an integrated pest management approach. And let's not forget pests. You did talk about fungicides, Karen. So fungi, insects, bacteria, viruses, rodents, weeds. All those things are going to be pests. And then depending on your production style, you're going to have different types of pests that you're going to be battling more so than others. And we just gave you an example of probably not going to be battling too many weeds in a closed greenhouse / high tunnel system, but you're still going to have a lot of insects.
But they're still going to be there.
Yeah, they're going to be there, but it's not going to be your major battle. It might, but probably not.
A lot of it depends on how old your high tunnel is and how long you've already been fighting those weeds. And like I said, it's your starting point. But I've seen some pretty weed-ridden high tunnels. But yeah, so let's go back to when you're looking at the difference between, your high tunnel and your field, Windborne Seeds, depending on if your high tunnel is screened or not, Windborne Seeds can come in, Windborne spores, which carry those fungicide or those fungal pathogens can come in. So that's little or no difference between being out in the field or being in a high tunnel. And then your splash dispersed diseases, you are going to have some protection in a high tunnel, typically because you're using drip irrigation instead of overhead irrigation. And, we've talked a lot about how splashing a lot of soil-borne diseases, they have to splash up onto the plants. But if that disease is in the soil, there's always that one emitter that bursts and you get splash. There's always a problem that, drip irrigation is not perfect. But also leaf wetness. Leaf wetness is a really hard thing in a high tunnel. You have higher humidity levels, and if those leaves get wet from condensation dripping off of the high tunnel, they have a harder time drying. And so that is one of the biggest challenges in a high tunnel that you don't necessarily have out in the field. And you'll see different diseases as a result of that.
And here's a plant that's very susceptible to overhead irrigation, splashing, etc. Tomatoes. Tomatoes are very susceptible to leaf diseases from splashing. So
Yeah.
I guess on a sidebar here, if you're growing tomatoes outside of a high tunnel, don't overhead irrigate those.
Yeah, and let's talk about tomatoes for a little bit. Tomatoes are pretty much like one crop that everybody grows. So let's talk about those for just a little bit. When you're growing tomatoes in a covered environment, like Dan was saying, they're very susceptible to that splash. So you always want to make sure that you're tying them up, that you're pruning off the lower leaves so that no soil can splash on those lower leaves where it enters the stomata on the leaves or the little holes that the leaves use to breathe through. And the fungal pathogen can splash up on there and it'll just crawl right inside that little tiny hole and make a home. So if there's no leaves close to the soil, it has a harder time infecting those leaves. But also just a general humidity, leaf mold is really common in high tunnels. And honestly, last year with the humidity that we had, or not last year, but the year before last, the humidity that we had out in our fields, we were even seeing leaf mold out in the fields if the plants weren't pruned enough, where you didn't have enough airflow between them. So plant spacing, again, is going to be critical. And also, when you're looking in a high tunnel, because you don't have a lot of rainfall at washing out the soil and your sunlight is diminished, that plastic is going to absorb some of the UV rays that are coming in. So it's not as bright as it would be outside, even if it is warmer than it is outside. So the soil-borne diseases actually will cause more problems because you have a longer rotation, and B, because they're not getting abused by nature.
Yeah, but you were saying about how, getting that full transparency is you're going to have reduced light coming in. So tomatoes just loving that high intense light. And another thing that they like is spacing and wind. The one thing what we didn't touch on is wind. In a high tunnel, you're not going to have wind unless you open up the sides, I guess. But
even then, it's going to be reduced.
But that kind of environment where you have spacing, where you have wind, and you have high sun drying out the leaves, not only drying out the leaves, but that high intense light just making the tomatoes bigger. Not going to have enough sunlight, and you're going to get very small or very low production tomatoes.
Also, you're going to have less sugar content in your tomatoes, and they're not going to be as good.
And that's why we typically do those leafy greens, because with most leafy greens like lettuce, lower light gives you thicker leaves. It's just a plant response to that atmosphere or to that environment.
Right.
But lower light gives you thicker leaves. Typically, it becomes greener because the plant's trying to capture
more chlorophyll.
Or you threw me off. the plant's trying to capture more light, and what it does is it just fills its leaves with chlorophyll so that no photon goes through without being captured. So you get thicker leaves, you get greener leaves. And if you ask me, that's the kind of lettuce I want to eat.
Yeah, and it's going to have more nutrients in it too, right? If it's got more leaf tissue, more chlorophyll, more structure, you're going to have more nutrient value, more fiber in it, and it's going to be more food.
We love it. We love it, and the insects love it.
Oh,
right,
this is true. This is true. But before we get too far off on that, I want to go to controlling those fungal pathogens right now.
Okay.
So when you're looking in a high tunnel, the loss of that wind that Dan mentioned is so critical, because when humidity is there, I mean, just you and I sitting on, a park bench, if the humidity is high, what do you want? You want a fan. And so do your plants. And so you've got to have fans in your high tunnel. And that is the one thing a lot of people forego when they build their high tunnels, because it's an extra expense. You have to run electricity to it. But it's so critical to be able to have that ventilation, because just raising the sides and opening the ends isn't enough sometimes, especially on those warm days where humidity is super high. So if you can get fans into your high tunnel, it doesn't take a whole lot just to keep that air moving. It's going to really reduce your
disease prevalence.
Your disease prevalence, yeah.
But you know what? I don't think it's that intuitive to, you're using a high tunnel to protect from the cold, and you don't think that you need something to cool the plants down or get the air moving so it dries the leaves at minimally. So I don't think it's the first thing people think of, but you're right. It's critical.
You also want to make sure that you're keeping up with your irrigation system. You're monitoring it, making sure there's not a lot of puddling, that there's not a leak somewhere, that you're addressing any overspray that's coming out of the system where you've got a puncture or your pressure's too high. Make sure that you are only irrigating when you need to irrigate. I highly, highly recommend getting a soil moisture meter for a high tunnel, because sometimes you feel the soil on top and it'll be bone dry and you're just like, wow, I really need to irrigate. But 2 inches down where the roots are, it's sopping wet. So this sometimes happens in our lovely clay soils in this area, but it also happens whenever you have a compacted layer underneath your high tunnel. So when you're first constructing your high tunnel, before you even put it on the ground, you really want to pay attention to how well that area drains. And if it doesn't drain well, or you have a seep on the side of the hill that's feeding into it, you've got to install French drains in there before you even get your soil ready for planting, because I have seen too many high tunnels that just basically are little swamps, and your plants are not going to be happy. Plants need those pore spaces to have air in them, those soil pores. There needs to be some oxygen available for the roots to have their respiration process and feed the plant. So make sure that you're checking the irrigation, make sure that you're monitoring your soil moisture with a tool, not just by looking at it. And then also make sure that if there is any runoff from around the area, that it is being drained off before it goes into your high tunnel, so you don't have water collecting and thus increasing the general humidity in that high tunnel.
And another approach you could take to that is using raised beds in a high tunnel situation, where you do increase the capacity of drainage. But
yeah, that's true.
With that also comes, with raised beds, they drain. They drain well. So you might have to irrigate more than you think. If you have experience with raised beds, you're probably not going to be surprised by it. But if you don't, when you start using raised beds, it's going to take some irrigation adjustments to figure out how much you're going to need.
Yeah, this is true. And also when you're irrigating, just like out in your garden or out in the field, irrigating in the morning is still the best time in high tunnels as well. So anytime if there is spray that goes onto the plants, you're allowing time for that water to evaporate off of the leaves and keep the leaves dry, especially overnight.
Okay, Karen, so what about growing zones? As far as utilizing them to manipulate the growing area that you're in to possibly grow different crops?
Well, growing zones are mostly going to be related to your freeze dates, right? So your last freeze and your first freeze. And they're going to be mostly adjusted by that. And a high tunnel is perfect for adjusting your freeze dates because you're protecting your plants from that utter cold. And, if you're planting your high tunnel properly, and let's say you're growing spinach, which is a nice cold weather crop, does really well and with low light conditions, you're growing spinach in your high tunnel and it's, West Virginia or Ohio, we'll allow that in too.
They're not that far
so
away.
West Virginia, Ohio, up in this upper Ohio River Valley area, you've got spinach grown in your high tunnel and you've got a row cover on top of your spinach inside your high tunnel. We've had farmers in West Virginia harvest spinach in January. And that's just crazy, You're looking at an area where we're in zone 6A, and, our frost date is October 21st, right? And so we're looking at, the end of our particular growing season is really past by now. And so if you have a high tunnel, you can expand that growing season so much. And if you think about that, the need and desire for fresh local foods is high. And if you can produce outside of your normal season, then your crop can help fill that demand and help keep the consumer buying local longer, which is going to help the local economy.
Yeah, no, and I totally get like what you're saying. I was even taking it as far as being able to grow varieties that normally don't grow in this area. If you have something that's set for zone 4, utilizing the high tunnels in a strategic way.
I would say if you're trying to grow, let's say avocados, right? Okay, avocados are a great crop. Avocados like hot temperatures, long growing season, but avocados are such an awesome crop because they don't ripen until after they're harvested. And so it allows a farmer to really extend that market season. But if you don't have the right temperatures, you're not going to be able to grow them. And I'm not going to advocate anyone grow anything weird in their high tunnel until you absolutely know you have a market for it.
Well, that's where I was getting at, was just growing something unique for a market niche.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't thinking about going into tropical trees, Karen. I was just honestly thinking more variations of, just kind of thinking out loud, I guess, over the microphone in a recording. But yeah, so that's another possibility you could do, is manipulate that growing zone. You might not be battling weeds, you might not be battling frost, but you're definitely going to be battling insects, right?
Yes, insects are something you cannot avoid in a high tunnel. And even if you take that extra step to screen your high tunnel to keep out things like cucumber beetle and some of the larger insects, you're still going to be fighting those little tiny guys that are huge pests in high tunnels, things like aphids, whiteflies, and thrips.
Yeah, I guess in a greenhouse setting, we do use biologicals to keep populations down. But in high tunnels, I don't think you're going to be using too many biologicals as much as you would in a greenhouse, but I guess you could.
You'd actually be surprised. It depends on how you're going to release them, and you have to really time your release in a high tunnel. There has to be food for the insect, and if your high tunnel is not screened, then it's going to be really difficult to establish a biological control because they'll just fly out into the weeds nearby.
And one other thing that I wanted to kind of point out is, we did touch on integrated pest management. Part of integrated pest management is making sure that you are rotating the modes of action of different pesticides, in this case, an insecticide. I've seen too many greenhouses where they use the same thing because it works. The problem is these insects develop resistance quickly. You basically have this microclimate, and insects reproduce exponentially. So it's not like the end of a season where all of a sudden you get a frost and everything dies and you start over next year. It keeps going. It keeps going. So if you have a residual population after a spray, that residual population is going to be more resistant. So you're going to have to start rotating different things to maintain that control. So that is something that you really have to think about as far as utilizing insecticides that are rated for greenhouses and high tunnels for insect control. You did mention thrips, right? We have researchers at Ohio State that do look at what works well for thrips and what's a good rotation to use, and also its effect on biologicals. But some recommended controls for something like thrips in a high tunnel / greenhouse environment would be something like using a spinosad like Conserve that would really knock down the population. But instead of following it with another spinosad chemical, like using Conserve as a spinosad, following that with Avid, which is a abamectin. Or you can go with Conserve and Pedestal, which is a novaluron, a different type of chemical, different mode of action. In this case, you're rotating things so that you're not developing that resistance. You're not going to be able to use your favorite chemical to really get the knockdown that you want without following it up with something different.
Yeah, and we also recommend if you are trying to use those soft pesticides or the reduced risk compounds, that you may want to have a separate sprayer that's designated just for them so that you're not going to potentially spray the residual, whatever was in there from last time, and potentially hurt your beneficials or just not be the pesticide that you want to use. So make sure that you are marking on your pesticide containers exactly what's in them, what the concentration is, and draw a line through it whenever you put something else in it. Make sure you're using the 3 rinses to make sure you're getting out as much of the residual as possible, and practice good pesticide safety practices. So when you're looking at controlling some of these pests with a biological control program, when you're in a high tunnel system, it's very different than in a greenhouse. It's much less controlled environment, but it's much more controlled than out in a field. So biological control program out in a field is going to be based more on setting up good habitat for your beneficial insects outside of the fields and encouraging them by having pollination stations inside your crop field. Now, when you're in a high tunnel, you can, like I mentioned before, you can screen out the edges of your high tunnel to help exclude pests, but also can help maintain your beneficial insects in there. Now, keep in mind, again, we talked about ventilation and humidity levels. That screen is going to block some of your ventilation. So you're going to need to address the loss of ventilation by adding the fan or another vent, something like that. But anyway, when you're looking at getting a biological started in your high tunnel, you have to know what your pest is. There's no point in getting a biological control for a pest that you aren't managing. When you're looking at a high tunnel, you really want to focus on monitoring and managing humidity, moisture on leaves. You want to set up your good crop rotations. You want to do everything in your power to reduce the problems instead of fight the problems. Stay ahead of it and know what problems you have so that you can then take steps to prevent those problems later. So, like I said, you want to have the right predator for the right problem, or well, for the wrong problem, but not really a right problem. But you want to have the right biological control agent for the pests that you're trying to manage. And you want to make sure that you're protecting your plants and giving them the best chance for success. Sanitation is going to be critical. And so making sure you have that weed-free zone around the outside perimeter and making sure that you are taking care of any weed populations inside your high tunnel so that you don't have a bedding zone for your pests. And make sure when you bring those transplants in that they are clean. You're not bringing in any weeds or any insects or any diseases with them. So get them from a reputable source and take good care to make sure that you've inspected them before you bring them into your tunnel. Always make sure that you are adding your biocontrol agents when the pest populations are low so that your biocontrol species are not overwhelmed and you don't have to use a spray, be it soft or not. Work on that weekly crop inspection to make sure that you keep up on things. A team of our colleagues from WVU are working to improve health in West Virginia. We need you to make your voices heard, as well as the voice of your community, by telling us your health needs. 1 in 14 West Virginians will be selected to participate in the Mountain State Assessment of Trends in Community Health Survey, or MATCH survey, to gather important health information specific to West Virginians. Why is this important? To improve the health of West Virginians, we need to hear from you. Your feedback will help the state and local communities better address your health needs, increase access to health resources, and better understand the reality of health in your community. Please, if you or someone you know happen to be one of the West Virginians randomly selected to participate in the MATCH survey, I encourage you to take the time to share your health experiences. COVID-19 vaccination protects you and those around you. When communities are vaccinated, fewer people get sick. Community immunity begins with each one of us. Visit vaccinate.wv.gov to learn more about COVID-19 vaccination. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.